just going to see if we have a few people here. Good evening, everyone. I'm Bob Jolly, Director of the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum, and on behalf of the Athenaeum, I welcome you to our snapshot series, The Ecology of Queer and Trans People in Education, with UVM Professor Jay Garvey. In just a minute, I'm going to introduce him, give a few more bits of information, but first here's Jacob Pelletier, who's the Community Program Officer of Vermont Humanities, to say hello to us.
Thank you, Bob, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I am really excited because right now is the time of the year where we just announced our new Vermont Reads Choice for the coming year of programming. So if you haven't heard of this wonderful book, Gather, by a local Vermont author, Kenneth Cadeau, it's about a young boy, Ian, growing up in rural Vermont and really trying to provide for his family and himself and put himself through high school while some challenges come through. And so we're excited to be launching that July 1st with our current Vermont Reads cycle. And project applications are live now. So please look up the information. If you have any questions, reach out to us directly, and we're excited to have you all here tonight. So I'll hand it back to Bob to get us started.
Thanks, Jacob. We extend our thanks to our partners at Vermont Humanities, as well as to the generous underwriters who make it possible for us to offer such rich and robust programming. The sponsor of our entire snapshot season is the Vermont Department of Libraries, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and the Alma Gibbs Donchen Foundation. Thank you to Kingdom Access TV for their support with the live stream. Tonight we come together from across the state to listen, to learn, and to be inspired in community. Before we begin, just a couple of announcements of events that are coming up. We have 3 upcoming presentations on the topic of restorative justice. I just want to read briefly from a flyer. The first one is tomorrow night, Thursday, May 16th, right here. Community Justice, the Community Restorative Justice Center, and it's an introduction to the staff and the programs. I'm a person who knows a little bit about community restorative justice and not much. So come here tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. On Thursday, May 23rd, there is a second presentation by the Community Restorative Justice Center. It's a conversation with people who have been through the program. So there'll be some staff members and some people who have gone through the process to say what worked, what didn't work. That should be a fascinating program. And Thursday, May 29th, there's an opening for an exhibit that's here. It's about the St. Joseph's Orphanage that was in Burlington, Vermont. There's an exhibit behind me in this space. So an open house for the exhibit at 6 p.m. and at 7 p.m., Perspectives on the St. Joseph's Orphanage Restorative Justice Inquiry with Brenda Hannon, Caitlin Hoffman, and Mark Winberg. One more program I want to mention. Lost my script here. Next Thursday, so not tomorrow, but next Thursday, Rick Winston will be here presenting Red Scare in Vermont. He has this book, which is relatively new, Red Scare in Vermont. So he'll be talking about the McCarthy era in Vermont from 1946 to 1960. You can find all these programs on our website. The next snapshot event will be hosted by the Norman Williams Public Library, called Environmental Humanities 101, Critical Studies for Feverish Times. That's May 22nd at 4 p.m. You can register online to get the live stream link. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker. Dr. Jay Garvey is the Executive Director for the Office of Institutional Research and Assessment and the Freeman Hipps Green and Gold Associate Professor of Education at the University of Vermont. He is the Principal Investigator for Cutie Pie, Queer and Trans People in Education, a multi-institutional research team with a mission to educate, advocate, and build coalitions that advance equitable policies and practices for queer and trans people in education. A book he co-edited, Case Studies for Student Development Theory, situates this evening's presentation within the larger context of inclusion in higher education, and the Athenaeum has a copy of this book. It's here. You can check it out if you're in the neighborhood, or ask for your favorite library to interlibrary loan it to you. Please welcome Jay Garvey.
I feel so grateful for being here. I don't have many occasions where I can slow down and think. I just recently took a new role as an administrator at the University of Vermont, so I feel like I'm running 100 24/7. And it was such a gift to be able to reflect upon queer and trans people in education through preparing this talk. I want to start by giving a deep bout of thanks for having me. I'm so appreciative for the invitation, and I come here with a lot of humility and gratitude and excitement for the talk today. So today I'm going to be talking about queer and trans people in education through ecological perspectives. The core focus of my talk is uplifting student experiences both in high school and colleges, with the goal of illuminating how various contexts overlap for queer and trans youth in education. I'm going to be talking about policies and schools, relationships and spaces, and of course identity development as part of the complicated tapestry of understanding queer and trans students in education. I often frame my talks and what I write about as if I'm speaking to four key audiences, and those very much permeate a lot of what I do. First is legislators, especially because there's a deep void in school and state and federal policies that support and uplift queer and trans people in education. I implore legislators who are listening and other people with political power, including voters, to learn from this talk and create new legislation or reform current legislation to center the beautiful messiness of what it means to be a queer and trans kid in schools. I also expect school and campus administrators to develop greater understanding about their role and responsibility to fostering student success. I especially call attention to their financial and political power to move along such initiatives. And as a former educator myself, I take great responsibility in translating my work to teachers and to counselors, to faculty and staff at schools and colleges who work with students. I also view family, that's both chosen and by birth, as important players in students' educational landscapes. And especially given the urgency of centering love and care at this particular moment of time for queer and trans youth, I hope this talk both creates directly translatable ideas for promoting more liberatory educational spaces, and equally as important, planting seeds for enduring systemic change. And lastly, and most importantly, I speak with a lot of love and solidarity and care for queer and trans people ourselves. I know at times, and quite often, honestly, in education, I've felt isolated and have looked to other queer and trans people in education to lean on for support and solidarity. So, for whomever is listening, know that every aspect of this talk, start to finish, beginning to end, is a direct conversation with you as queer and trans people, and I'm here for you without hesitation, and I offer my support and solidarity as you navigate through education with all of your brilliance. Before jumping into the content of my talk, I want to share a bit about myself. The lens through which I primarily view the world is through my gay and queer identity. I also situate myself as a white cisgender man who currently benefits from the financial and positional privilege of being an administrator and faculty member at the University of Vermont. And combined, these social locations really shape my interactions with and my deep perception that education can be a site for liberation and joy. I attended high school in a suburb of Syracuse and graduated with about 600 people. I grew up in what I consider the Northeast Rust Belt, characterized by fading industrial economies and conservatism that's deeply rooted in white normative working class rurality values. I have 3 sisters who I love, who all live in Syracuse still, and we're all very close and very much close in age as well. My parents are so supportive beyond measure, and I'm thankful that both my husband and I have a loving relationship with all of our parents. I enrolled as an undergraduate student at the University of Delaware in 2002, shortly after 9/11, shortly after the untimely death of Matthew Shepard, for those of you who remember, and in the midst of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, federal policy as a result of Bill Clinton. Although I did well in school, I really had a clear direction of my purpose in life. And from an outside perspective, I was thriving academically and socially, yet internally I was really struggling to find mentors, possibility models, kinship, community. I relied heavily on my peers, largely through my co-curricular engagements, and often viewed academics as like a side project that I wasn't really connected to. All through college, and high school for that matter, I hid my sexuality from everyone in my life, including myself, to be honest. To cope, especially during college, I would engage in high-risk binge drinking and other unhealthy behaviors. It wasn't until a week before I graduated undergrad that I came out to all of my friends as gay. I would later come out to my parents and my sisters 2 years later. However, at that point, I had become so acculturated to equating a social scene with gay people as a social scene with drinking and nightlife. My high-risk binge drinking continued through my doc studies, and I finally gave up drinking about 12 years ago. I mention all of this because my relationship with peer support through gay and queer communities nearly disappeared when I stopped drinking, because most of my social supports were part of the nightlife scene. I didn't really find a professional purpose until partway through my master's program. I was studying school psychology at The Ohio State University. I experienced a number of queer-phobic and transphobic instances with faculty and site supervisors indirectly calling me perverted for sharing my sexuality with students. And it really discouraged me from pursuing a career in education. In the advice of a great mentor, I pivoted and I explored higher education as a professional source for myself. I later enrolled in a doctoral program in student affairs at the University of Maryland. And when I was there, I worked as an academic advisor for undergraduate students. I worked in queer and trans student services, and I did my due diligence, as a lot of people in higher ed do, working in res life and living in the res halls. I then began to realize the potential for higher education and serving as a site for affirmation for queer and trans people, including myself. Upon graduating, I took my first faculty job at the University of Alabama, and it was an abrupt acculturation for a queer New Yorker who had only ever lived in the Northeast. I once again was a faculty in residence. I lived in the residence halls with about 1,200 first-year undergraduate students. And it was really there that I learned with a lot of humility and gratitude the importance of intersectional justice. It was 2013. It was about 50 years after Governor Wallace said his racist remarks, "Segregation today, tomorrow, and forever," in front of the building where I was working. It was also the building where Arthur and Lucy, the first black student at Alabama, escaped a mob of angry white people in the exact same building that I was working. And in fact, in the same year, the University of Alabama made national news for never having admitted a woman of color into one of their predominantly white sororities. So here I was, this eager beaver 29-year-old faculty member, super queer, super gay, all day, every day, not really acknowledging my whiteness or my identity as a cis man in the space. I look back at that time because who I am and the experiences I have really shaped the imperative that queer and trans justice can only happen through intersectional lens. I'm now in my 11th year as a faculty member at the University of Vermont, and still doing the queer trans thing, the queer trans hustle all day, every day, professional gay. And as I mentioned, this past fall, I took an administrative job overseeing institutional research and assessment at the university. And for the first time in my career, I'm able to pursue an actualized change on a much more localized level, which has unearthed a whole new set of blessings and challenges. Okay, so the TLDR is, why did I share all of this with you? Well, first, I think we're all inherently subjective people. And so knowing where I situate myself in terms of my identity and my experiences and my orientation towards change is relevant to understanding what I'm discussing today. And then second, my story is one of many of how education is a very complex and interwoven tapestry for queer and trans students. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, I'm going to be overviewing policy, schools and institutions, relationships and spaces, and identity development. Every single one of those aspects had a profound impact on my own narrative as a queer student and as an educator. Of course, I'm not going to be able to provide a universal guide to how we can all understand every queer and trans student. Nor do I really think a universal guide exists, because hello, queerness. But I'm going to provide as many broad brushstrokes as I can today, and some contours so you can understand how I'm navigating the beautiful complexities of serving queer and trans students and educators. Okay, so real talk for a second. Defining terms is kind of a contentious thing among queer and trans educators and researchers. So on one hand, as queer theorists would say, to define what queer is a decidedly unqueer thing to do. But on the other hand, some may argue that the evolving nature of terms requires that I, as a presenter, provide a helpful on-ramp for listeners. Yet others say it's not the responsibility of queer and trans people to educate cisgender and heterosexual people. But tonight, I'm putting on my educator hat, and I'm going to provide a few cursory term overviews. But just know that there is a gorgeous mosaic of terms, both systems related and identity related, and I certainly don't have the time to overview them all. So for queer and trans people especially, some of these may feel rudimentary and perhaps unnecessary, but I hope that you see my effort as a way to educate others so you don't have to take on this labor yourself. I'm going to first talk about how to differentiate sex assigned at birth and gender identity. Individuals often conflate assigned sex with gender identity, however, they're distinct, yet interrelated. Sex is assigned at birth by a medical practitioner and is largely determined by physical attributes such as genitalia, sex chromosomes, sex hormones, and internal reproductive structures. Sex assigned at birth is often construed as a binary of male and female, yet intersex people exist beyond those boundaries, though medical professionals don't always recognize intersex people. Gender identity, as opposed to as sex assigned at birth, is an individual's internal sense of their gender, which may or may not align with society's linear construction of sex that they were assigned at birth. I also want to differentiate gender identity versus expression. While gender identity and expression can be interrelated, they don't have to be. Once again, gender identity is an individual's internal understanding of themselves as it relates to their gender. Gender expression, on the other hand, is how an individual expresses their gender through clothing, demeanor, etc. How one expresses their gender is not necessarily related to their gender identity. Gender expression may be a way for individuals to play with external gender performance and explore roles, while gender identity is an interior, enduring sense of self. Both can be fluid, both can change over time, and they need not change together. Sexual identity is often conflated with gender identity, yet sexual identity refers to an individual's romantic and sexual attraction to others, or lack thereof, in the terms of asexual identity. Gender identity describes an internal self of gender. Sexual identity is a separate concept that relates to a person's internal self of their romantic and or sexual attraction. A new term that's really cool that's been introduced recently by gender scholars is called gender modality. and that identifies trans people in large-scale population studies. Gender modality refers to how a person's gender identity stands in relation to their sex assigned at birth. It's an open-ended category which includes being trans and being cisgender, and welcomes the elaboration of further terms which speak to the diverse experiences people may have between gender and sex and gender identity. I just want to note that the cisgender, transgender binary is challenged by some non-binary people, especially agender people, and some intersex people as well. It also creates a space for reflection on how gender is culturally situated and how terms like transgender and cisgender don't always reflect understandings of all genders in all societies. This image is from GLSEN, which is formerly the Gay and Lesbian Straight Educators Network, and they provide a bunch of fabulous infographics and discussion guides on terminology related to gender, sex, and sexuality. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into each of the following categories, overviewing first policy, schools and institutions, relationships, and then identity development. But before getting into that, I want to talk about what exactly ecological theory is, or a school ecology or campus ecology. Wren and Arnold in 2003 reconceptualized Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, which some of you social scientists may be familiar with, to provide a nested understanding of how schools and colleges work. Wren and Arnold theorized that students' experiences are a result of the interaction between unique environmental systems in which they live and interact, which emphasizes peer culture and school environments. They're often conceptualized in nested terms, like one of those dolls where you package it inside each other, and include microsystems, mesosystems, exosystems, macrosystems, and my favorite, of course, as a nearing 40-year-old, chronosystems, which highlights time and differences by generations. Microsystems include influential groups in which students belong, such as families and peers and roommates. Mesosystems are created through the interactions of those microsystems. So for example, the first time in school, when you bring your best friend home to meet your parents, or when you're at a party and your faculty instructors meet your roommate for the first time, that's what one might call a mesosystem. Exosystems are what I largely focus on in my scholarship, and that includes laws, policies, and structures in which students interact, but sometimes have little control of in their lives. When I teach students about ecological theory, the two key words I often mention are proximal and distal relationships. Items that are proximal are on the center of the circle, including friendship groups and roommates and families, for example. Those have a much stronger and direct and immediate enduring impact on students than exosystems, for example, a state's non-discrimination policies for queer and trans students in education. Yet, of course, as you're thinking, well, doesn't all of that matter? Yes, absolutely. And the interplay between those is kind of where the fun stuff happens. And so as I begin my talk, consider how things are nested within each other and how distal experiences might be shaped differently than proximal experiences. First, let's begin with policy, which can be messy and somewhat discouraging. So, buckle up. So, I think a lot about the 2016 election. It was a dramatic shift in the legal landscape for queer and trans people. There was an article in Times that kind of foretold of this change. It was entitled, 2015 Made History for LGBT Rights, Why Few Are Optimistic About 2016. During the Obama administration, as many of you know, legal rights and representation in judicial and legislative bodies increased for queer and trans people. In contrast, Trump's presidency saw legal and cultural attacks against queer and trans people nationally and, unfortunately, quite unfortunately, locally. The Trump administration wreaked havoc on protections for queer and trans people, including a vast narrowing of federal non-discrimination legislation to exclude queer and trans people from Title IX legislation, while local and state legislators contested restroom bills to limit the safety of trans people in the public sectors. Queer and trans students of color and queer and trans immigrant students in particular faced additional threats to their success in school. through the Muslim ban, uncertainty of the continuation of deferred action for childhood arrivals, or DACA, increased detention and deportation, continued voter suppression, and the threatening and eventual potential dismantling of affirmative action. The assault on queer and trans rights was especially felt in education with the appointment of Betsy DeVos as the Secretary of Education, who eliminated trans student rights, diminished sexual assault prevention measures, narrowed Title IX legislation in schools and universities, and expand schools' rights to discriminate under the mask of school choice while removing federal funding from public institutions. Even though the Biden administration has reversed a number of these oppressive policies since 2020, there's still, as many of us are aware, a violent assault in the US on the rights of queer and trans students, which is largely taking place, as we know, in state legislatures. In the current hostile socio-political landscape, students and educators and administrators and parents are witnessing and experiencing huge vacuums in state and school protections for equitable educational experiences for queer and trans students. You'll note the graph here. As of 2023, the American Civil Liberties Union documented 233 bills aimed to restrict queer and trans rights in schools, with 34 passed into law and 69 having advanced or being introduced. Lambda Legal is a national organization, and they overviewed anti-queer and trans school legislation, such as oppressive measures in curricula and documentation. They've noted that these protections or attacks vary widely by geographic regions and state political acts. I will note that this list of 233 bills includes one piece of legislation in Vermont, and I want to highlight this to say, oftentimes we think of Vermont as a queer beacon of inclusion, yet there's still a violent assault in legislative bodies. This piece of legislation, H513, was developed by Representatives Arthur Peterson in Rutland, Larry Labor in Essex-Orleans, Terry Williams in Caledonia, and Charles Wilson in Caledonia, aimed at instituting a school sports ban for trans and non-binary students. In addition to state legislative attacks, education leaders must reckon with the invisibility and exclusion of queer and trans students in education policy that has predated these rollbacks. There are few federal mandates or consistent statewide legislation that has institutionalized non-discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. This concern is symptomatic of not only the political attacks on queer and trans survival, but also of a demonstrated and coordinated local attack to ensure queer and trans students don't succeed in schools. I'll also note, as a data nerd, or self-described quantitative queer, that there are few education data systems that exist that include sexuality and gender. And what does that mean exactly? It means that data-driven decision-making at institutions and at state legislators are at a complete void for how to serve queer and trans students, because we have no evidence at state or federal levels to document disparities or joys and successes of queer and trans students. And in my opinion, this dearth of queer and trans student data dehumanizes us and erases our educational experiences, both in schools and colleges and universities. In my opinion, however, the responsibility for ensuring success for all students, including queer and trans students, must primarily rest on the actions and advocacy of administrators. I'm going to talk about a few institutional policies at schools and colleges that have a deep impact on not just the success of queer and trans students, but the basic dignity and worth of all queer and trans people who have involvement in education. There's 5 policies that I'm going to overview. And of course, this isn't an exhaustive list, but I think these policies have both symbolic and practical importance in promoting holistic wellness for queer and trans students. So the first, and what I might argue the most important, is non-discrimination policies. Non-discrimination policies, as we know, affirm that discrimination will not be tolerated, outline what qualifies as discrimination, and they also explain the consequences for violating such policies. Because there are no federal protections for queer and trans people, and a number of states don't have statewide protections, non-discrimination policies at school and college levels are often only the course of action for protections in schools for queer and trans people. Yet there is a huge disparity across schools for how and if queer and trans people are included in these protections. The next I want to mention is more specific to higher education, though for schools that have boarding opportunities, it's also relevant. Policies that govern access to housing based on gender and/or sex have a huge impact on trans and non-binary students, because being provided with a safe living environment has immediate consequences for belonging, safety, and ultimately their academic success. Conversely, trans students who don't have access to gender-inclusive housing options face isolation, institutional genderism, they rarely feel comfortable physically, and they struggle academically as a result. According to the Trans Policy Clearinghouse that is hosted by Dr. Jenny Beeman at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, there are only 272 colleges and universities in the US that provide gender-inclusive or all-gender housing options. And of course, institutional approaches to how to offer these vary greatly. Some restrictively saying trans students can only have single bedrooms, which of course has financial consequences because at colleges oftentimes rooms are prorated based on how desirable they are. Other times, living learning communities are created that create a social and academic experience for queer and trans students to be in community residentially. Related to housing is restrooms, and this is where we've seen a lot of state legislative priorities to attack trans and non-binary youth. Gender-inclusive restrooms, and I would also say locker rooms, are important for schools that seek to create a safer and more affirming environment for trans and non-binary students who often report harassment and violence in gendered bathrooms. Having all gender or non-gendered or gender-inclusive restrooms makes schools safer and slightly more comfortable for trans and non-binary youth. Schools, if they have single-user restrooms, for crying out loud, should change those to all-gender restrooms. You would have zero financial consequences besides paying $40 for a change of a sign. And single-user restrooms not only promote the dignity of trans and non-binary people, but they promote intersectional access because they provide safe facilities for caretakers, disabled students and students with disabilities, and people who require private space for health, medical, or religious reasons. Colleges in particular should consider creating campus maps where community members can locate all gender or gender-inclusive restrooms. And I recognize that it takes fiscal and administrative action for schools to modify existing restrooms. But I will also note that that is a huge symbolic gesture that administrators can make to demonstrate a transformative climate for trans and non-binary youth in their school settings. The next I want to mention is student health policies. Queer and trans students often rely on campus student health services or in-school nurses for preventative care, sexual health care, mental health care, and other health concerns. Unfortunately, though, many queer and trans students encounter heterosexism and cissexism in healthcare spaces, such as being misgendered, assuming to be heterosexual or cisgender, or interacting with a provider who is not informed on how to treat or care for their needs based on their gender identities or genders of their sexual partners. The last I want to mention is kind of driven by my perspective as an institutional researcher, and that's student records. Student records are an important gateway for tracking student experiences and metrics at schools and colleges, including academic performance, pathways and transitions through college, perception-based measures like climate and belonging, and basic metrics like how many trans students there are in a school. School records should, in my opinion, provide options for students to report their sexual identity, chosen name, pronouns, and/or gender identity by choice, of course, not a forced response, because these records are often tied to class rosters, communication with students, and various school initiatives. Especially in higher education, institutional data enables students to be connected to resources on campus and to track their success as students and as graduates. Unfortunately, these mechanisms are widely not available at nearly all schools and colleges, which in turn, once again, creates a data void for understanding queer and trans student experiences, and also creates negative consequences for building community, for sharing resources, and for examining differences or trends in retention across sexual and gender identities. From informal interactions with peers to academic classrooms, student success, as I mentioned before, is so profoundly shaped by the interactions and relationships that students experience across various spaces. Particularly for students who are marginalized in education, including but not limited to queer and trans people, spaces that promote a warm climate, belonging, and community are absolutely critical for their academic success, for their wellness as people, and for their overall pathways through their lives. Queer and trans students need spaces where they can build peer communities, where they can get involved, build leadership and civic engagement skills, and benefit from mentorship from educators and peers alike. Especially because queer and trans students must exist in educational spaces that inherently disadvantage and oppress them, spaces that promote kinship and safety are vital. Before delving into some of these spaces, I wanted to overview two key concepts that I've been mentioning. The first is school or campus climate, and the second is belonging. School and campus climate refers to the cumulative attitudes, behaviors, and standards of students concerning access for, inclusion in, and level of respect for individual and group needs, abilities, and potential. Education climate's a really difficult thing to grasp, but it's really critical for student success in education. I often think about climate through the image of a heat map. Imagine you're looking at a school. Places that are glowing in red and orange are places of affirmation and safety where students feel joy. Maybe it's the cafeteria or the sports fields or in the parking lot hanging out with their friends. Places that are chilly in blues and purples are spaces where they feel devalued and not respected. That might include interactions with a counselor or where they've received bullying in the restrooms. And so as we proceed with climate, think about a heat map as an image. Although a lot of research has documented gradual progress in climate, of course, since I was a student and beyond, queer and trans students still experience uninviting environments that are not conducive to their academic or personal success. Now, relatedly, belonging is defined by Terrell Strayhorn, an education scholar, as a student's perceived social support on campus, a feeling or sensation of connectedness, the experience of mattering or feeling cared about, of being accepted, respected, valued by, and important to groups that they care about. Belongingness has both cognitive or thinking aspects or affective and feeling aspects, combining students' own self-perceptions of their role within groups with their own self-assessment of their own actions and how they're perceived by others. Sense of belonging is not solely a human need, but also a dominating, motivating force that shapes community and student behaviors. Belonging has immense ties to students' academic achievement and success. It's especially salient for queer and trans students because experiences of marginalization can generate barriers to fulfilling a sense of belonging within academic spaces. When a student's personal safety is at risk, they are less likely to feel a sense of belonging or identify with the school community, which of course, as you might guess, has huge implications for their perception of survival as a student, which in consequence may lead to their departure from school. And as you may have guessed, sense of belonging is largely tied to a hierarchy of needs, where a student's immediate sense of safety is of the utmost importance, which puts it into chilly perspective as we overviewed federal, state, and institutional policies. Relationships are why I do everything. Not only am I queer, but I'm a Cancer, so I'm like very feelings forward. And I think largely about justice and liberation through relationships with other people and through coalition building, as was mentioned in Cutie Pie's values, one of them being building coalitions. In my opinion, relationships with peers and educators are the cornerstone of a student's successful experience in education. Positive interactions with peers can mitigate negative climate, can promote belonging. It can promote community, which is integral to surviving and thriving in education. For queer and trans students in particular, who seek to form friendships, community and kinship networks help them explore their identity, build friendships, engage with campus resources, and even activism. These relationships may take the form of looser networking, of tight bonds, or in some cases, what they would describe as chosen family, all of which have proven to be survival strategies for queer and trans students in oppressive institutions. Kinship is particularly important for queer and trans students who experience rejection or discomfort from their family. And these relationships often take the form of familial bonds with their peers. These kinship relationships transcend school friendships at times and often form the basis for queer and trans students to create safety for and with each other in schools. Queer and trans peer relationships foster space for students to share their stories, to make meaning of their experiences together, and to validate each other when they feel isolated. Affirming supportive peer networks promote self-esteem, a sense of purpose in life, and a healthy adjustment period for queer and trans students. Oftentimes, queer and trans students may bond in community over common struggles, and they may choose to build power through planning actions or engaging in activism together to bring about change. Educators as well have a significant impact on queer and trans student success. Imagine how often an educator spends with youth. What a profound and meaningful impact it would have on their relationships. Educators support students as advisors through being role models and through being visible in informal settings. Queer and trans students feel more academically integrated and socially connected in schools where they have consistent and meaningful interactions with educators. However, educators can create harm when they promote queerphobic or transphobic rhetoric, when they erase or don't include queer and trans people in their curricula, or when they uphold binary and cis-sexist understandings of gender in their class, i.e., get to your seats, ladies and gentlemen. Queer and trans students notice when educators interrupt and confront heterosexist, cis-sexist, binarist classroom comments, and when they defend queer and trans students. Educators who are knowledgeable about queer and trans people and who include these topics in their course materials empower queer and trans students, and I may argue all students across all genders and sexualities, but particularly for queer and trans students who wish to see themselves in their academic pursuits. Queer and trans students, as documented in social science research, feel safer, and they report an overall stronger sense of wellness when educators ask for and use affirming names, pronouns for all students inside and outside of their classrooms. When they notice the way heterosexist and cis-sexist assumptions show up in their teaching, and when they make efforts to mitigate harm from other students or educators, or to accommodate queer and trans students. I also want to give a brief nod to student organizations like Gender and Sexuality Alliance clubs and activism. These initiatives create opportunities for students to grow as leaders, for them to build community and civic engagement, to learn from each other, and engage in community change. In these organic, yet sometimes bureaucratic organizations, students engage with queer and trans language and discourse, they foster community, and they mobilize together. Queer and trans student organizations provide a space where students experience belonging and connection, both of which have important and enduring impacts on their overall success. Regarding leadership development, queer and trans students may engage as positional leaders within queer and trans organizations and formal networks, or they may take a different path as transformational queer activists. These students, in particular, often envision and enact change outside of formal decision-making channels. They organize actions and create other ways to voice their concerns at schools, and they engage in activism, often as a form of survival from hegemonic spaces in their classrooms. Before moving on to implications, I want to close with identity development, which may, of course, be the most proximal experience one may navigate as traversing the educational landscape. Theories of identity development help educators understand how students grow and increase complexity of their own developmental capabilities. Identity development, in particular, emerged in the 90s, often relied on stage-like psychological understandings of sexual identity, and to a lesser extent, gender identity, focusing mostly on coming out as a catalyst for identity formation. Regarding gender identity, there are very few models that have historically included people outside of the restrictive gender binary of cisgender men and women. Only recently have development scholars emphasized the entanglement of assigned sex, gender, gender identity, gender expression, in the formation of a person's gender and gender identity, including much more recent theories centering trans and non-binary students. There's three key concepts that really permeate sexual and gender identity development models, and I'm going to review those briefly. The first, as I mentioned, is outness and identity disclosure. Outness, according to Sorgen, refers to the extent that queer and trans people disclose their identities to others. Contemporary identity development scholars, including myself, do not view outness as a singular experience or one that should be exalted as an ending point or even an entry point for a developmental journey for all people. Having a clear formation of one's identity can, however, promote greater clarity in which academic and professional goals may be pursued. Additionally, identity disclosure promotes community among peers and teachers, and these connections are particularly important because fostering connections is a defining characteristic for retaining students. Although outness should not be viewed as a desired or attainable outcome for everyone, students who have a strong internal sense of themselves are more easily able to navigate potentially negative external contexts in order to persist. I also want to overview some systems that may complicate development. Queer and trans students must continually navigate hostile environments that perpetuate queerphobia, transphobia, acephobia, monosexism. And of course, for students with multiply marginalized identities, these environments are also deeply connected to racism and classism, ableism, xenophobia, and other oppressive contexts. These oppressive environments can have deep impacts on students' educational trajectories. For example, from an intersectional perspective, queer and trans students who don't see themselves, who don't have queer and trans educators as possibility models, may not feel wholly represented in their educational experiences. Such isolation and lack of representation may impact students' decision to pursue specific academic disciplines. which is largely borrowed from the Women in STEM initiative that originated in the 80s from Hall and Sandler, or their education altogether. In addition, there are countless processes that require students to place themselves in restrictive gender and sex binaries. The perpetual misgendering of trans people in high school and college records in particular can have a cumulative detrimental impact on a student's decision to continue or discontinue their education. I also want to overview normativity. When queer and trans students are able to envision more complex images of themselves, they are more likely to feel whole and centered. However, as we know, schools are permeated by normative expectations of gender, sexuality, and expression. Dominant societal narratives of masculinity and femininity are key examples how subjects like nursing or engineering are reinforced by society's dominant and oppressive rules for expressing gender and sexuality. The concept of homonormativity provides another interesting angle for understanding and critiquing these systems. Queer and trans people who ascribe to homonormative assumptions often perpetuate the narrative that we are just like you, straight and cisgender people, instead of resisting normative ways of being. When seeking this acceptance, queer and trans people assume and center dominance such as whiteness or being cisgender or monosexuality, thereby marginalizing queer and trans people of color or agender, asexual, bisexual, intersex, and non-binary people. I want to note that creating hierarchies of power within queer and trans community is not only inherently a non-queer act, but it's detrimental to queer and trans liberation. It causes active harm, and it perpetuates oppressive environments with queer and trans communities in education. That particularly has a detrimental impact on queer and trans students of color, queer and trans disabled students and students with disabilities, and trans and non-binary students as well. Institutional change isn't a one-time fix. Change is ongoing, and it requires considerable and sustainable effort to enact more socially just policies and practices. Doing so, in my opinion, necessitates a team of multiple stakeholders, including administrators, staff, educators, students, families, and key influences outside of schools, for example, state legislators, community nonprofits, and community organizers. I'm going to overview just a few key implications that I hope will not only center queer and trans students, but also positively transform education for all students and educators. The first is that I encourage administrators to perform an equity audit for all marginalized communities to assess current policies and practices and consider the impacts of school climate through intersectional lenses. Administrators should also bolster existing queer and trans committees with administrative support, representation, and communication. For everyone, I encourage us to embrace sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and gender modality as essential parts of the school equity lexicon. We must also consider who is at the leadership table and what other leadership tables may already exist with underrepresented visionaries at the helm. Representation matters. Therefore, promoting, hiring, and recruiting queer and trans people, educators, people of color, and queer and trans people with disabilities in all positions in education and administrative roles is essential. There are countless studies that call for the need for equity training for all educators. I implore people to understand that these trainings must be intersectional in nature and must always consider and recognize the unique needs of people at the intersection of marginalizing systems. School is not a linear experience. Some of us have strong recollections of high school and perhaps college, and therefore promoting involvement among graduates and alums may not only increase representation of queer and trans people on boards of education and trustees, but it's also symbolic for queer and trans people in education and may foster healing for people who had negative and harmful and at times hostile learning environments. It may offer reconciliation for people who had violent experiences at their schools. Regarding policy and legislation, once again, the void of affirming policies across federal, state, and institutional sectors requires a lens that includes various stakeholders that apply to policymakers, legislators, and administrators. Some of these, as you notice, may not be germane to education. However, I think that these matter to queer and trans students and do have a profound impact on their success at school. The first thing that we must do is educate ourselves about queer and trans oppression across all facets of society. We must use our knowledge to actively dismantle institutional and societal oppression, particularly in public sectors like employment, housing, and education, to promote equity and thriving in education and beyond. We must embrace queer and trans people as an important constituent in state and federal policy. And we must recognize how the historical exclusion of queer and trans people in legislation has festered invisibility and unaccountability for representatives and legislators among public sectors. We must consider how the underrepresentation of queer and trans people in political office affects policy inclusion. We must encourage queer and trans people to run for local, state, and federal government positions so they may provide voice and representation at their choosing across all sectors of public office. As a higher education scholar, I'd be remiss if I didn't share that we should all collectively be advocating for state and federal legislation that provides free access to higher education, because I believe education is a human right that is deserving of everyone, regardless of income and wealth capacity. We must work to dismantle harmful and restrictive interpretations of Title IX to protect queer and trans students, and also to expand other federal and state legislation to include protections on the basis of sexual and gender identities. Lastly, queer and trans people experience all facets of life. So in order to promote student success, more progressive policies must be passed to guarantee universal health care, protect against discrimination in work and employment and housing, to defund and demilitarize hostile police, to provide pathways to citizenship and decriminalize immigration, to increase gun control and gun control legislation, especially in schools, and to mandate paid family leave, among others. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate being here. I'm so happy to field questions or to engage in a discussion if folks have anything to share. And perhaps if you feel comfortable, you can share your name and your pronouns if you choose when introducing your question.
Share my name and what?
Pronouns if you choose. So I would say my name is Jay and I use he, him pronouns.
Oh, I'm David. I'm so used to him, he.
Fabulous. Pleasure to meet you.
So first, thank you. I feel so much more informed about the whole subject. And it seems like at one point you said maybe it's not someone's job to educate
Yes.
about this subject maybe, but I'm thinking of the issue of indigenous rights, for example. In different countries, there's special property rights for indigenous people, but then you get into the problem of, well, was your grandmother not a local whatever?
Yes.
You know, so who are we talking about? So I am left with, who are you talking about when you say queer?
Fabulous.
Actually.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you asking. You know, as a former educator, I kind of have sneaky slides where I think some people might ask questions, and so I have such a response. And so I'm first going to provide a brief definition of queer, and then complicated. The first thing I want to share is representation is a fickle thing, and oftentimes for minoritized communities, I try to invite a space for people to step up if they wish without ever providing a requirement that they do so. So that's kind of when I said it's not queer and trans people's responsibility to educate others, but I've selected a platform to educate others, which is why I'm talking about it. And so I hope that that kind of makes sense in terms of what I was sharing. Let's see. So there's a queer theorist from the late 2000s who, as I mentioned, said to define what queer is a decidedly unqueer thing to do. And that's because queer is a non-normative embodiment. If you think about gender as a box that exists in space, the point of queerness is to dismantle the box so that gender doesn't exist. And so from a queer theoretical perspective, queerness is expansive in all of its beauty and non-normativity. But in the case of this talk, I often use queer as an umbrella term to identify anyone with a sexual identity that may be considered minoritized. In other words, anyone who's not straight or heterosexual. And that may include people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, poly, and everything in between. Now, of course, comes the term trans, which is also, for some, considered an umbrella term for people who do not identify as cisgender. And what I mean by cisgender is someone who's assigned sex at birth aligns with society's expectation of their gender. So for example, with myself, I was assigned male at birth and I identify as a man. Those things align with society's expectation, and so I may consider myself cisgender. People who are trans or transgender may express or identify a gender that does not conform to society's expectation with the relationship of their assigned sex at birth. So someone who is assigned female at birth, for example, may identify as agender, or gender fluid, or gender F, or non-binary, or as a trans man. So in the sense of my talk, queer and trans are being served as umbrella terms for people who have minoritized or marginalized or non-normative sexual and gender identities. It's also generational. And so sometimes I write about college graduates a lot. I did a study once that looked at LGBTQ college graduates who graduated all the way from the 1940s to the 2010s. It was really cool. And I mapped on historical LGBTQ landmarks in the United States that related to students' experiences when they were in college. I loved it. It's called General Perceptions of Campus Climate for LGBTQ People. Check it out. But the word queer is contested. So one of my mentors and his husband, Jerry and Sanford, are in their 70s. And they may not use the umbrella term queer. They may use LGBT or LGBTQ in different ways. And that's kind of the beauty of language and the messiness of it as well. It's like a really cozy winter sweater. That's kind of how I vision language in queer and trans communities, because I get one snaggle and then I just find myself with a ball of yarn that I'm playing with for 20 years. And so it's complicated and not at the same time. So by centering language and also trying to decenter language, I use queer and trans as kind of a representative term.
Hi, my name is Simone, and I use she, her pronouns.
Hi.
I really appreciated this conversation, and my background is in social work. I work as a school therapist.
Yay!
And I still feel like I have more to learn, especially, especially around this topic, but just especially when thinking about policies that impact our students. And one thing that you said that struck me is something that I thought a lot about, and you talked about housing. And especially, I know you were kind of talking about higher education, but I guess I would love to hear your thoughts or, research that you've done around policies that support students in high school, boarding schools, because that is something that I've thought a lot about, especially in small communities, right? Small boarding schools, like what are the best policies to create around that? What is, and I'd love to hear your insight on that.
I have so many thoughts. I feel like we should go on a 4-hour coffee chat to discuss all of the things. I also want to mention, I absolutely love working with social workers.
I think we're pretty awesome.
Yes, the whole profession.
Yeah.
In fact, we have an undergraduate intern, a social work intern working in our office next year when we're trying to revamp how demographic data are collected at the University of Vermont. And it's just, like, social workers, I mean, hello, what profession, what helping profession provides more of an ecological perspective than social workers? So I'm so glad you're here. Yeah, most of my stints have been in higher education. I've worked with folks who do field placements for doctoral students in remote environments. I wrote a book about how colleges can institute trans and non-binary inclusive housing policies. And I've also thought a great deal about the K-12 environment. My first thought is creating, it's like universal design. Creating an environment that dismantles genderism benefits everyone, and particularly trans and non-binary people. When I work with organizations who are trying to revamp their housing policies, and it's mostly, interestingly enough, been like, as I mentioned, research facilities at universities. Like they have a research facility in the Arctic that has 6 beds, and they're trying to figure out how to accommodate various needs on the basis of gender. If your first step forward is embracing the beautiful messiness of gender, then it will serve everyone. So how do you do that? Well, it might be doing an audit of all policies relating to housing accommodations and seeing where gender permeates, and if it actually has to exist within that realm of a policy. I think it's also an opportunity where the more agency you can provide people, the more cared for they're going to feel. And I think so much about data as an institutional researcher, and I think there's a lot of power in data. And so when I consider, for example, an intake form for a boarding school or for temporary housing for a family in need, it's similar to like leading organizations. I want to invite a conversation but never require anyone to do it. And so on a form, I want to invite people to share what might be gender salient for them and what their gender-based needs are, and then accommodate those. But blanket exclusionary policies are not only illegal in certain jurisdictions, but they're so wholly unnecessary, and they're often reactive and don't have material impact on the youth that they're serving. So it feels somewhat like a workaround, but I think really critically examining genderism in one's organization and assumptions that people have about the safety of cisgender women in particular, and cisgender girls, is an important foundation to start. And it's complicated, and I'm saying this as a cisgender man, it's complicated to hold that complexity, because we also want to ensure the dignity and respect of everyone, including cisgender women, but not at the expense of other people. That's such a complicated answer. I hope that helps.
No, I appreciate it. I assumed it might be a complicated answer. I still continue to think about it, right?
Yeah.
And so I knew there's not this one clear answer, but I'm curious. I'd love to hear about your book. What's the title of your book that you were mentioning?
Trans housing policies and practices. There's also, as I mentioned in my talk, the Trans Policy Clearinghouse. That's organized by Dr. Jenny Beeman at UMass Amherst. And that includes a hyperlink to every policy that every university has in college regarding the Trans Policy Clearinghouse. And if you search for UMass or Campus Pride, you should be able to find it. And that includes hyperlinks to every all gender housing policy at every college and university. And I hope and I suspect that that could be an inspiration guide for boarding schools or other secondary schools that are looking for housing accommodation policies.
So Jacob, he, him pronouns. Thank you for this, Jay. I don't know how you can answer this or not, but with your role with institutional research, what are you kind of hopeful of with being in that role and kind of the projects that you're taking on there?
I just recently wrote a piece called Queer Pragmatism, and I kind of play with that term because I've been talking about queerness so much, and then you might be thinking, this person just took a job in institutional research, which is like the most normative functional area in every college setting. I'm legally required to define metrics for how we measure people's identities. But I think it's profoundly provocative. And I just completed a study with the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, which is an organization in DC, where we looked at, we did a national inventory of policies related to data collection for every college and university in the US. And we found, of course, that very few collect sexuality or gender beyond the binary. And what was even more interesting, we also collected administrators' perspectives of change and of justice and inclusion. And people who had a stronger perception on education as a site for equity and inclusion were more likely to include policies at their institution that collected what we call SOGI data, or sexual orientation and gender identity data. At the University of Vermont, I'm starting a project called the Lived Identity and Demographic Project, which centers the dignity and rights and confidentiality and fidelity of data that centers on people's identities. And I've mentioned my identities a lot in this talk, but it's largely the complications of who I am as a queer person and as a cisgender white man, that we're doing this holistically with all social identities, including gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, nationality, citizenship, disability status, social class. So I think it's going to be complicated because, as you might guess, a lot of our guidelines institutionally for institutional research are mandated by the Department of Education federally. But I would argue that we can create a web that is more human-centered and complicated at the institutional level, and then metrically and transparently say, we have this beautiful mosaic. We are required to reduce it to this less beautiful tapestry for federal reporting. I think that can be done metrically, and I think it's a community-centered approach when we are transparent. So in other words, I can imagine us eventually saying, how do you identify your sexuality? And have a list of 9. there may even be a question that says, for federal reporting purposes, we are legally required to report with these 3 categories. Which of those categories feels most affirming for you? And so you might report it twice. Other institutions may decide on the back end to create that organizing scheme, but if they do that, I encourage them to report it publicly. I think a lot of people use FERPA, oddly enough HIPAA, which totally medicalizes, especially trans people, and pathologizes their identities. And Title IX to say we're not legally allowed to ask these questions, and it is completely false. This study that I just mentioned, there was also a policy analysis done by the Williams Institute out of UCLA that demonstrated statewide policies that are restricting these uses. Nowhere in FAFSA or HIPAA or Title IX does it say institutions are not permitted for risk of safety or privacy or confidentiality. Institutional researchers collect a wealth of data that is very sensitive, and we take our jobs very seriously for holding those confidentially. There's absolutely no reason why the beautiful complexity of students' identities, and for that matter, employees' identities, shouldn't be considered the same. So, please reach out to me in a year and say, how is that project going? The reason I'm mentioning it so much too is, this is like my first leadership role in academia, and I've learned the power of like public testimony for holding people accountable. And so everywhere I go, I'm sharing this project because I need to hold myself accountable, and I also need to hold people at UVM who hold institutional power accountable for allowing me to pursue it, which they graciously are. Special shout out to my boss, Provost Patty Prelock.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're just checking to see if there are any online.
Fabulous. Sounds good.
Then I have an awfully prosaic question.
Yes, please.
I'm Bob Jolly. I don't disclose my pronouns because I worry it's a form of outing for people who don't want to do it.
Thank you for sharing.
And that has been a consideration of mine. But my question is, by creating non-gendered spaces, and this is going to sound like a bathroom thing, are we creating unsafe spaces for women? I'm 67, I watched whatever second wave feminism was, whatever wave that really was. I was educated by women who said, we have been putting up with a lot of crap. We are slowly achieving some autonomy, we're addressing misogyny. Is it potentially a problem to say by having really ungendered spaces, women will be subjected to male predators? I mean, I know that's terribly prosaic, but
Yep.
I actually do really worry that it could be a step backwards. Because we're assuming they're not out there, I guess.
I appreciate you asking, and I have a responsibility to be able to address this question as someone who talks about queer trans topics. And I also want to recognize with humility as a cisgendered man, my perspective is limited. I will note that violent sexual acts and sexual assaults are most often frequently perpetuated by cisgender men in public spaces, and very seldom by trans and non-binary people, especially in bathrooms. That's the first thing I want to mention. The second is, there are many different possibilities of all gender facilities. And so one may imagine, do you remember the recent national news about an airport whose restrooms were open wash spaces with towels and sinks, and then closed single-use stalls. And so that promotes the dignity of people and also still holds people publicly accountable for being decent human beings. Some may view a world where gender and the oppressive forces there within don't exist. And I hold those people with great love and appreciation, because my imagination doesn't stretch that far. but the possibilities they imagine that I think have never been previously possible are the ones that push policy and legislation. And so even if I'm standing here self-admittedly a normative queer at times, I think a lot about Dean Spade, for example, who writes about the institutional violence of policies and how they create unintended harm. And one may argue that genderism, or the entire infrastructure of education policy, if dismantled, would lead to a world of gender utopia and dreaming that we can't even imagine. And so when we talk about all gender facilities, that's the hope that I hold. And I lean on people like theorist Munoz, who talk about the utopia of a gender-free society where we may exist in our humanness. And until then, I'm going to navigate the messy and necessary advocacy as a cisgender person to emphasize the importance of facilities that recognize the dignity of trans and non-binary people. Great question, a complicated answer.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Sure. I'm a snow bunny. I'm from Syracuse. People often call it Sibyricuse. I love the snow so much, and I think I'm still holding on to like my wool and my flannel, but I feel like the seasons are changing, aren't they?
I mean, who knows? Sometimes it snows in May. You never know. You never know.
I love living up in Georgia with my husband because I feel like it's like perpetually like 4 degrees cooler than Chittenden County. Are there any more questions from folks?
So, and that goes, because Bob brought up the McCarthy era. Are there any concerns about a future Joseph McCarthy of let's clean up this population that's now handily identified, everywhere.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that last part.
For data gathering reasons.
Because I've been a champion for data collection for years. And do you all remember when they tried the initiative to pink the census in leading up to the 2020 census to include sexuality and gender in the census? I was pushing hard for it. And I wasn't listening to undocumented communities who were saying, please, for the love of God, don't create another mechanism for the surveillance state. And I've been really critical about myself and what I'm advocating for. And it really relates to the article I mentioned earlier about queer pragmatism. There's a sociologist in the UK, her name is Kath Brown, their name is Kath Brown, and they wrote a piece called Quantifying Queerness or Selling My Queer Soul. And it talks about the compromises that we make for quantifying ourselves. One of those being, we're now complicit with the surveillance state and government entities. And so in such a queer sense, I'm caught in between. And maybe for the first time in my life as an institutional researcher and as a queer person, I'm okay with that. I don't know if you've ever read Borderland Theory by Gloria Anzaldúa. Just speaks about the gift and the blessing of existing in between. And so I'm advocating for these, and I'm also resisting them as a queer person. And I think for now in my life, I'm okay with that. Because I'm not sure of the answer, honestly, to be frank, of if we're creating a negative tool of the surveillance state, whether that exists at the institution or the state and federal level.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's lovely to have you. And to
people listening at home, thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Mr. Garvey, thank you so much.
I appreciate it so much. Thanks for having me.